Matt, let's kick things off and just tell us a little bit, who is Matt Paul? How did you get here? And why are you the Metaverse guy on the internet?
That's a good question. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and really glad to see so many people turning out. This is my first time on stage in quite some time, probably many people in the audience coming here. And it's a good way to talk about this topic, the metaverse. But to answer your question more directly, I at one point was a forest firefighter. I did initial attack, and so it's been a big change since then. But most of my professional career has been focused on what I thought was next. In the late 2000s, it was the mobile app economy. Shortly thereafter, I worked with a number of media companies to figure out what's the role of their business in the online era. That was dynamic ad insertion. What does a CPM online look like? How do they move their content rights, their platform, their customer relationships to apps? And as part of that, I went to work for Peter Chernin at the Chernin Group when he was building his private venture vehicle to build, buy, develop, scale online communities. We worked with companies such as Crunchyroll, Headspace, Twitter, Pandora, often to acquire a majority stake in the company, Barstool Sports being a good example of that. And then subsequent to that, I went to Amazon, where I was the first head of strategy for Amazon Studios, which ran everything that we would think of today as Prime Video. At that point, seemed like the next big thing, which was streaming video. But that
What year was this?
That was 2016. And then very quickly, that started to become a solved problem. It was clear how you launched a video player, what competition with Netflix looked like. That's why we have so many darn streaming services today. And then the next thing to me seemed to be video gaming. And very quickly, it was clear that human leisure, entertainment, virtual worlds, and simulations were becoming something far more different, not just technically more complex, but more culturally integral. And so that led me to the metaverse, and I'm as surprised as anyone that it has become such a topic du jour. But here we are.
Any fun stories you can share from working with Jeff Bezos?
That's a good question. I mean, I was in the meeting where he infamously, reportedly demanded for his Game of Thrones, which didn't happen as reported, but as we know, there's always a little bit of truth to press exaggeration. But no, I mean, I can tell you the most incredible thing about working with Jeff is the degree to which he so immediately mastered or outranked everyone whose job was focused more narrowly.
I've heard a lot of funny stories about him, but we won't go into that. Let's stay on the metaverse.
I did see his body mass swell. I was there for the more bookish Jeff Bezos, and then Jack Terminator Jeff Bezos.
The 1997 videos from his interviews, it's like he's like this very nice nerd guy, and it's funny to see the transformation. People talk a lot about the metaverse. It's one of the most misused terms on the internet today. Can you help us understand what in your mind is a metaverse or metaverses? What properties do these things need to have or not have? Just how do you think about them?
It's a good question. I think about it very much like one thinks about the internet, which is it's easy to think of a platform as embodying the internet, but there's a reason why we don't say Google or Facebook or Amazon or Apple is the internet. We think about the underlying protocols, TCP/IP, that enable continuity of things like identity of content, of different experiences, but most importantly, networks. The early internet in the mid-90s connected 40,000 different networks, with the ability to safely exchange information, to talk to one another, to determine what was exposed and what was not, and that collectively produced the internet. When I think about the metaverse, I think of an evolved version of that, but across virtual worlds and simulations for content, identity, experiences that are predominantly 3D rendered, but are more visual and immersive.
So one of the things that I always struggle with when I think about the internet analogy is that the internet protocol is a stateless protocol. But in metaverse, people talk about permanence, object ownership, these things. Do you think persistence, permanence matters? Or are there multiple metaverses, some that have them, some that don't? How do you think about the notion of permanence in the system?
Yeah, I think you would want to think of it more from the interesting thing about any discussion around the metaverse is you want to think about it more from philosophical principles, and then its specific instantiations of a service, a content, an experience that may or may not have that attribute. That's what I think you were thinking of. I think about it from the perspective of the internet, as an example, exists without any one website, any one DNS, any one company. That's persistent.
Right.
Now, there are many experiences within that internet that have varying attributes, much like many virtual worlds and video games experiences, platforms may persist, they may not, but it's that broader architecture that they all exist. The hope among many, as an example, would be something as finite as The Sims in Electronic Arts. Even if that server is shut down, that game no longer exists, there would be persistence of the things that you own within that environment. That your data, your history, your social network, your graph can persist beyond that within this broader construct of the metaverse.
So beyond persistence, you've outlined some of the other kind of key attributes a metaverse needs to have, or maybe metaverse experiences should or shouldn't have. Can you touch on what some of those key ones are?
I mean, the most important way to start about this is often one of the areas in which people get to Web3 and the metaverse is two conflated ideals that I would separate a little bit. I define the metaverse from the perspective of a massively scaled and interoperable network of real-time rendered 3D virtual worlds that can be experienced synchronously and persistently by essentially everyone on Earth, and which supports continuity of key components of data: identity, history, payments, virtual objects, and goods. Not everything within there means every single sub-experience will have those. There will be virtual worlds inside the metaverse that don't support continuity of data. There will be experiences within the metaverse that aren't persistent, that are capped to 10 people, not everyone on Earth. But again, they all sit within that broader interoperable framework, much like there are websites that are taken offline, there are websites that are paywalled, there are websites and online communities limited to 10 or 100 people. That kind of connects to this Web3 element, which is, from my perspective, Web3 and crypto aren't inextricably linked to that definition. And that's because I'm perceiving it as real-time rendered 3D virtual worlds. The question to me is, are the principles of Web3, are blockchain technologies most likely to drive a more successful, thriving, and globally relevant metaverse?
So you actually just led into the next question, which is, why are all the crypto people, myself included, think this is going to be an important substrate in these systems?
I think the fundamental answer is, if you believe that the metaverse is going to be a place where an ever-growing share of time, labor, leisure, spend, wealth, and happiness is to exist, then we would expect for many of the similar structures we have in the real world to be there. And if they're not, we won't lean in. And by that I mean property rights, a really important part of any business, individual ownership of objects, the fact that you control your goods, your objects, you can control who is in and who isn't, and that there's relatively free movement of both labor and capital at large is what makes the economy here thrive. Put another way, would you buy a $2 million house if the government could repossess it at any point? If the government could decide to turn off the utility systems? If the government could decide that they're going to repossess your lawn? You might still buy property, you would buy less of it, and you would probably focus your energies elsewhere. And that's where you start to get into this idea of, are the underlying frameworks in blockchain, the technologies, and frankly, the cultural principles more likely to produce a thriving metaverse?
Yeah, one thing we always joke about, just some history. So when Vitalik, actually, there's a long story. He's the founder of Ethereum. He used to play World of Warcraft when he was a kid, and they like turned off one of the servers or one of the guilds or something, and he lost one of his swords. He'd spent like 50 hours leveling it up. And that is supposedly an inspiration for why he launched Ethereum. But that's a rumor. I don't know to what extent cause and effect are true. But it's an interesting thought, and like you think, how do you have property rights? Do Facebook and Google and Apple enforce them? Does the blockchain enforce them? Maybe we end up in a heterogeneous environment. The other kind of related concept of property rights that just kind of occurred to me is physics. We all take physics for granted. We have gravity and chemistry. These things are all defined for us. We don't have to think about them. But in the metaverse, actually, we can play with physics. Have you given much thought to like who gets to control physics and how like that might or might not work?
Yeah, it's actually a really good way to speak about crypto at large, which is to say, atoms are write once, run anywhere. And as a result, we have this brilliant opportunity where, let's say a Nike store can decide not to admit Adidas shoes. It would be a foolish decision, we all recognize that, but it's exclusively a business decision. They don't have to understand how competing shoes work. They don't have to read their data. They don't have to understand what the impact of a specific sole means for their floor. And that facilitates a lot of interoperability. The problem is, in virtual environments, there are no atoms. There's only data. And data requires code to run, and it needs to sit within a much broader framework of other code to have relevance. And therefore, every time we have interoperability, while many misuse the term interoperable assets don't exist because we're just talking about data, and that's an active choice, not a passive choice. It's not, I'm going to allow competing shoes into my store. It's, I'm going to choose to admit code, and I'm going to build other code to incorporate that data. And so we start to understand this broad macro question, which is then, why is the metaverse terrifying? I don't think the metaverse is terrifying for escapism reasons. I'm often asked, like, don't you think it's horrifying that people wouldn't want to go to Iceland to stay inside the metaverse in a VR headset? And the answer is 300 million Americans watch an average of 5.5 hours a day of television. The average senior watches 7.5 hours of television per day. I don't think anyone in this room has designs to retire so that they can watch 200 hours of TV. And so I'm not really worried about the metaverse from an escapism perspective. I think it's much better to substitute from TV, passive solo entertainment on the couch. But we have to all ask this question of who owns the atoms? Who owns a virtual atom? Who determines the physics? Tim Sweeney has said that if one company gains control of the underlying frameworks for the metaverse, they will be more powerful than any corporation or state on earth. They will be like a walking god. And that's because, to your point, they would define the physics, and as scared as we might be about what Apple can or cannot do, they could seemingly coerce you to admit competing store shoes. And so this gets to the crypto question as I ramble on, which is everyone in the virtual entertainment space has to come up with this answer. Well, what physics are we going to run? Who's going to determine them? What are they going to be? And there aren't universal answers for that. But what we do know is no one's going to sign up for someone else's physics. What we do see, therefore, in crypto is where many of these companies, the most legacy companies on earth, which with some exceptions such as Steam, are at least agreeing as to what the structure is going to be for entitlements. Who's going to manage what you own? Who's going to manage respecting when you sell that good to me? And that sits without their control, but they're rapidly embracing it. And so there's at least optimism as to how we can end up in a world in which everyone accepts foreign atoms, but doesn't need to control them themselves.
So this kind of leads from physics and ownership into the next segment here. Mark Zuckerberg gave a presentation a few weeks ago renaming Facebook to Meta. One of the most interesting kind of theories posited there is that you will experience the metaverse from multiple physical forms of media. Glasses, VR, look at your laptop screen, maybe with an Xbox controller, I mean, who knows? Do you have any opinions there on order of operations, how these things play out, where people will prefer to experience the metaverse? Just how do you think about this multimodal experience?
It's a good question. I mean, again, I start from the perspective of if you believe the metaverse is going to be a parallel form of existence or plane of existence, then you want to think about what's most likely to make it thrive. My perspective would be greater control to the developers and the individual users is best for the metaverse economy. But similarly, you would think that the ubiquity of those technologies and your ability to access it from more modalities in more places more easily is also going to lift the metaverse. If all of us need a PlayStation 5, then I'm not going to experience it here on this chair, and I'm not going to experience it when I'm outside of the home or office as well. And so the expectation is that greater ubiquity of access and variance in the actual experiences will facilitate that. In much the same way we all laughed when Samsung said you can now have a fridge with the internet, but there is some utility to doing that. And so overall, we expect that there will be multiple different ways to interact with it: AR, VR, wristbands, brain-to-computer interfaces. The big question now is, how far away are some of those other experiences? And the truth is they're a lot farther than Facebook and others believe. Most estimates say that in 2030, there will be 250 to 300 million active VR and AR headsets in market. let's first recognize that those are two very different devices.
Extremely, yeah.
And so we're probably talking about a world in which there's 125 of one, 125 of the other. But even if there's 4 times as many, that will be 1/6 as many smartphones as exist in the world. And so that's where you get into the criticality of smartphone-related controls, permissions, regulations, because those will still, for the most part, be the dominant way in which we interact with the digital world and the metaverse at large.
One thing that reminds me of is, in the first presentation in which Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone, he pulls up NewYorkTimes.com and goes to the website, and he brags about the fact that you can render NewYorkTimes.com on an iPhone. It's funny because he has to zoom into the page, and he actually highlights, oh, look, you can zoom, and it zooms intelligently. It's funny to think now that that was a bug, not a feature, that you don't want to render the full New York Times site on your iPhone. You want an optimized experience. I think it's going to lead to a bunch of really interesting things where you're going to have content that's misformatted for the modality that you're using. I think it's going to all come back to kind of this idea of standards and everything else that you just alluded to.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I invest pretty broadly around this theme, and it's interesting to note why so many companies get these tech platform shifts wrong. And it's usually because they understand the macro shift. People are going from offline to online. They understand online to mobile. But the number of subordinate assumptions you need to make to actually thrive are pretty manifold. So for example, I'm sure everyone in the crowd is familiar with Facebook's famed pivot to mobile, how quickly their revenue shifted to mobile. That's partly because they messed up the early transition. In 2008, Apple came out with the App Store. In 2009, they had their famous campaign, There's an App for That. In 2010, Sesame Street parodied that campaign, and yet it wasn't until 2012 that Apple wrote a native app for the iPhone. Prior to that, they were using a thin client that was running on HTML5. Mark was a big believer in HTML5.
HTML5, I remember that.
Within 1 month of that 2012 pivot, they doubled time in the newsfeed. Just imagine any technical shift you could do within 1 month to double time in your application. That led to a massive shift of revenue, but they couldn't actually catch up for all of that. In 2009, WhatsApp launched with the explicit purpose of being a mobile app native communication platform. In 2009, the day that WhatsApp launched, Facebook had 340 million monthly active users. WhatsApp had 0. By 2014, Mark acquires the company for $20 billion. Today, WhatsApp is their most successful mobile product. That difference between still having full conviction in the future but misreading the specifics of the technology is why we see displacement.
I remember that the old Facebook app, you had a home screen within the app with the nine icons, and I remember thinking how miserable it was. You'd open the app from the icons and you have more icons.
What's funny is that Mark in 2012 said it was the greatest strategic mistake they had ever made, a point that seems somewhat quaint in hindsight, but tells you.
Yeah. Okay, so people, there's a lot of people in crypto today, a lot of pitches we get say the word metaverse in them. Mostly they're referring to games in those pitches. There's a pretty rich history of games that have tried to build a virtual universe with persistence, with money, with an economy. Some of the most notable ones are Fortnite, not really Fortnite, but EVE Online, and World of Warcraft and some others. Do you think of these as proto-metaverses? Do you think of them as baby metaverses? How do you try and project from what we see out of these game universes forward, or is there a transition? Just how do we get from where these games are to some new future state?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s, you had the emergence of multi-user dungeons or multi-user shared hallucinations. Those aspired to be social spaces with some form of continuity where groups of people could come together in a purely synthetic environment and collaborate with relatively little structure. Those muds and mushes in the 70s were text-based. In the 1980s, actually pioneered by something from LucasArts, which released in 1982 before Return of the Jedi, was a game called Habitat, and it was a version of that was 2D and pictorial. By the 1990s, you start to get to the first 2.5D or isometric 3D. That's where you have the perspective that makes it look like it's 3D, but it's not fully 3D. And then shortly thereafter, in the early 2000s, you get the first, what we really consider to be a proto-metaverse in Second Life. It's 3D, you have in-game economies.
And Grand Theft Auto 3 was, I think, 01.
Yes. But the difference is the economic growth. Like Second Life actually had an in-world economy with a stock exchange. You could raise money in Second Life that would reach hundreds of millions of dollars in implied value. And even in 2004, the GDP of Second Life was close to $500 million. And then we start to get into the next decade, which is the 2010s. That's when those experiences start to reach tens of millions of daily players, hundreds of millions of monthly players. And it brings to this question of why we're talking about the metaverse right now. And there's a mix of answers. Some are cultural and time specific, which is the pandemic. But for the most part, we're seeing technologies emerge which actually support the shift of human existence into these virtual planes. 5 years ago, you could not have tens of people in a visually rich shared simulation. Not possible. Imagine, would this conference exist if you could only have 7 people in the audience? Probably not. Would you go to a sporting match if there were only 4 other people and 2 could be your friends at most? Would you go to a concert? This ability to actually bring large numbers of people into a shared simulation is important. But part of that is also from other technologies. Crypto is a good example of something that could have emerged earlier and of course was here long before the possibility of dozens of people in a shared simulation. But the embrace of that as a technology has led to massive investment from individual users in purely virtual goods. It's providing the construct for a functioning economy that transcends any one environment and has led many different brands to actually seed investment in these virtual worlds altogether. I saw this morning Budweiser did its first NFT collection. Why anyone bought it is beyond me, but there's significance
for a beer.
There's significance in these brands legitimizing these spaces in one way or another. And so basically we've been on this 50-year trajectory from text to 2D to 2.5D to 3D to 3D immersive. And now we're at the point in which culture is ready, commerce is ready, and society at large no longer considers them to be fringe games. Those are all coming together right now in 2021.
And so do you think, like EVE Online has been the one that always stands out to me the most. It's a very rich economy. It's probably, what, 10 years old or something, maybe longer?
2003.
Oh, wow, it's 18 years old. And you know, you can be an avatar and explore. Do these things, are they already metaverses in their own right?
Let me pivot the question a little bit because it gets to why we're talking about this right now. For those not familiar, EVE Online is a single sharded game with hundreds of thousands of users that never stops. It's been running essentially continuously for 18 years with a unified economy with hundreds of thousands of people all participating in a shared goal. We might be in different factions conquering space. There are people who go undercover for years with a competing faction to one day betray them. And
like undercover spies.
yeah, and what's amazing about this is when that battle happens, you have—
It's like America-Russia thing, is that how this
yeah,
works?
not unlike that. At some point, we'll be watching the Americans' EVE Online edition. And when those battles happen, you have millions of dollars of virtual goods destroyed in a minute. But what's fascinating about EVE Online is while it has many of the attributes we think of with the metaverse, it's persistent, everyone's in the same experience, we can all experience it together. It's a good example of how technology has changed. In EVE Online, the only things being rendered are ships. They have all these design choices that are why it's possible. It's in space, which means you don't need to render a background. It's just wallpaper. You're in space, so there's nothing you can actually do to see an individual. Rendering a human moving and jumping and dancing is hard, but showing 15 ships that are slowly moving that don't have facial expressions is pretty easy. They tether all of these servers together, but because of travel time, they actually hide server loading times behind the need to move from one galaxy to another.
Right.
The reason why hundreds of thousands of people can be in this shared simulation at the same time is because no one is in the same spot in the galaxy at any one point. And whereas a battle might require you to converge, some people might take 50 minutes to travel there. And so it's actually a brilliant example of a game that seems to be exactly what we want, that was available 20 years ago, that was ingeniously built around these limitations. Right. You conquer space, but you never go to a planet. And so the expectation is that we will continuously get closer to their philosophy, but with greater fidelity.
The evolution of that, are there any, I wonder if there's any good guides written on the history of this thing, because that's just, it was so ambitious for when it launched, and even still is. All right, so next let's talk a little bit about front ends. The two companies people most think about when they think about building the user experience modality are probably Apple and Meta, formerly known as Facebook. The other really interesting player on this front is probably Microsoft. How do you think about Microsoft work from home, enterprise, metaverse stuff?
I think it's interesting from a few perspectives. I think the most encouraging has to be the ways in which almost the losers of the mobile generation have had to change their perspective. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, has said that they were on the wrong side of open source. That was a really pivotal and important quote for Microsoft, which has continuously opened up over the last 5 years. I think we can reasonably ask whether or not they would have had that change of perspective if they had the control that Apple does today and hadn't been so wholly squeezed out of mobile device operating systems and hardware. But they're a good example of a company that has said we need to open up. We can't own the world, we can't control it, and we certainly can't extinguish our competitors. And so they have a bunch of capabilities, but they continuously show themselves to be a more a la carte provider. If you want this one thing, you can take it. They seem to be a force for good. Facebook is another example. I mean, I think we all have reasonable skepticism as to their intentions, but Facebook, again, having been mostly squeezed out of the mobile era, their business model, their services, their software, now their data collection is more up to Apple than it is for them. And so they're putting forward a far different philosophical approach. They're saying we're going to indefinitely allow sideloading on our devices. We're going to allow you to self-bill on our devices. We're going to charge 12%, not 30% on our devices. And they're starting to open up APIs that they've long closed. In 2013, they closed the Instagram API that connected to Twitter cards. They turned that back on.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there are some other good examples. Anyone who was dating 4 or 5 years ago might know that you could connect your Facebook account to your Tinder or Bumble or Hinge account and input your social graph. Well, about 2 years after that, Facebook announced that they were going to launch their dating profile, their dating service, and so they closed off that API. You can still bring your Facebook photos over, but not your social graph. And so I think there's still a lot to be determined as to whether or not these companies speak about endless interoperability versus choose it on a case-by-case basis.
So I want to unpack Microsoft a little more here, just because I think they're the most enterprisey. In the 90s, people first adopted PCs at work primarily, and then started to buy them at home and such. I'd say the most common theory has been gaming will be kind of the most proto-metaversey like things. But given the rise of COVID and a lot of people working from home, there's a new interesting theory floating around on, what if work from home is actually the first kind of proto-metaverse thing? Given Microsoft's dominance with Teams and other workplace technologies, do you give credence to that theory? Do you think we will in fact have large numbers of people wearing VR headsets and working from home in a collaborative space? Has that happened before we get to more consumer-like metaverse experiences?
It's a good question, and you're really bringing up an important question I get a lot, which is why are we talking about video games, this relatively small leisure category, as being at the front end of a large
Not
scale?
small anymore.
It's still fairly small. I mean, it's 180 billion. That's not that large. Television is a $650 billion industry. It's funny, the gaming industry likes to say they're bigger than Hollywood. The box office is 40 billion, and there's about 450 billion in TV. And so it's a very, it's like apples to orange seeds comparison. But so to take a step back, I mean, most people will say that there have been 3 primary computing and networking waves thus far: the mainframe era, the personal computing and fixed line internet era, and then the mobile and cloud era. All 3 of those waves started from either government or mega enterprise. Then they shifted to large companies, then SMBs, then prosumers, and then consumers. Why is that? And the answer is, early in these transitions, you have enormous constraints, typically on bandwidth and computing power. When you have those constraints, it's rare that those capabilities are useful to a consumer, a parent, a kid. But even with limited bandwidth and limited processing power, an enterprise had utility from connectivity. You could share unstructured data sheets, you could send an email, a message. There's a reason why many of us adopted BlackBerries before our kids ever got a smartphone or our grandparents did. You needed massive expansions in bandwidth and in processing power and device capability to be able to do things like Snapchat and Facebook, Spotify, Netflix. Why is it that the metaverse is starting consumer and then moving? And that's because the constraint in simulation has been realism and fidelity and reliability. We talk about determinative physics in engines. Unreal is a non-deterministic engine. Well, for a simulation environment in engineering or architecture, non-determination is not great.
Yeah, it's not good.
But it turns out that it's pretty good for a game. The UK military does an extraordinarily large amount of army training in simulation, but non-realistic fire from the 1980s doesn't help anyone invade Afghanistan. And so it's mostly from games that we have had advancements. Jensen Huang, the founder and CEO of NVIDIA, now the 6th largest company, has said that when he founded the company in 1993, it was based on the premise that spatial and rendered computing would be necessary to solve problems that general purpose computing could not. But the only industry which could finance investments in improved GPUs was going to be the gaming space, because it had 3 unique attributes. It was large, it was fast growing, and it was computationally complex. Most industries have 1 or 2 of those. Biomedicine is large and complex, but it wasn't nearly as fast growing. And so now we're at this point in time in which gaming-related companies have the capabilities, whether through GPUs compute at NVIDIA or Epic and Unity for rendering in game engines, that everyone else is catching up to. They also have one other benefit, which is they produce experiences someone wants. Facebook has had Horizon for years, but you and I have no desire to go to a crummy VR simulation to talk. And so these gaming companies have a purpose. Why is Microsoft so interesting? Well, Microsoft essentially has that full stack. They have their gaming side of the business with multiple engines, their consumer hardware. They have Azure. They have Bing Maps for enterprise, which still operates and has the world's largest drone-based coverage of the global map. They have advanced simulation capabilities, and they have a suite of enterprise products that are used to produce digital and virtual twins, as well as a reason for people outside of a video game to go into a virtual environment, whether that's for collaboration, engineering, or teams.
I would actually argue it's interesting because I'm sorry, it's forced, right? I mean, the first people who used email were told to use email. Probably they're going to get 500 people to say, oh, I want to use email now. I think the idea that you can force a strong word, but it's top down. Hey guys, here's your headset. We're all going to work together. Is going to be a very interesting catalyst for these things.
Yeah. That said, I'm generally pretty skeptical as to whether or not anyone wants to do a VR version of Microsoft Teams, but
yeah, I do want to turn off my video on most of my Zoom calls, but
right, and so it's funny, like that's actually one of the common responses, which is like, well, wouldn't you want an avatar? And it's like, sure, but that's so that I'm not on camera. Why don't we just ditch that in the first place? But yeah, I'm with you.